Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, mediodía, ¿no? Aquí no sabemos muy bien qué hora será en Mozambique, pero eh,
8 de la noche.
ya sí nos imaginábamos. Bien, pues muchas gracias a todos los que han venido y todos los que nos verán por transmisión virtual. Um, Me toca presentar al ponente de la conferencia de hoy, que es mi colega y amigo de estudios de área, el profesor Christopher Laundrie, um, que hoy nos va a hablar sobre Timor-Leste y hasta ahí lo dejo para que él explique, pero me da muchísimo placer poder presentarlo. Él es profesor investigador en el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África. Su trabajo se centra en Indonesia y Timor-Leste, pero también en la región del sureste de Asia en general. Sus temas de interés y estudio incluyen política comparada, relaciones internacionales, revolución y separatismo, reconciliación posconflicto, religión y política, y el sureste de Asia durante la época colonial. Su libro sobre separatismo en Indonesia, intitulado Enfrentando el Leviatán, se publicará en 2022, ya es muy pronto, ya está, ¿no? Ya está casi listo. Y fue coautor de Narrative Landmines, un libro premiado sobre rumores y terrorismo. Ha publicado en Asian Studies, American Behavioral Scientist, Small Wars Journal, Estudios de Asia y África, Oral History Review, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Asian Politics and Policy, Contemporary Islam y Situations, Cultural Studies in the Asian Context, entre otras revistas académicas. Pues, Chris, mucho gusto. Te dejo a ti la mesa para que podamos comenzar.
Ok, muchas gracias, Carlos. Let me share the screen here. Oops. And I can't see up there. Let's see. Aquí está? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you again, Carlos. I also want to say thank you to Satomi Miura for setting this up. Andres, of course, for presenting as well. I want to thank the board for the Journal of Estudios de Asia y África here at Colmex, and the coordinator for publications, Adrián Muñoz, and our editor, of course, Cynthia Godoy. Adrián and the board accepted my proposal for an edition of the journal to sort of commemorate 20 years of independence in Timor-Leste from various perspectives. And so I put that together, and that's what this talk is. So I'm speaking in English because I've had a crazy semester and haven't had time to prepare this in Spanish. And I think probably perhaps more people will see this online as well. I was joking with Carlos, it reminds me a little bit of activism in the early 1990s of Timor-Leste, because speaking to a room of about 6 or 7 people was pretty common. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. In my talk today, I'm not going to repeat what was written in the essays, but it's also important to acknowledge them. Clinton Fernandez wrote a fantastic article on Australia-Timor-Leste relations. Australia's Timor-Leste's closest neighbor besides Indonesia, and Australia was the first government to recognize the Indonesian occupation of Timor-Leste because it wanted the oil that was there. So the relations between Australia and Timor-Leste remain fraught today, and Australia is still interested in Timorese oil. Charles Shiner, a close friend of mine, and a co-founder of the NGO, the East Timor Action Network in the United States, wrote a great article about the resource curse, this idea that poor countries that have resources generally turn out to be authoritarian in nature. Timor-Leste has so far escaped that and remains democratic, but they're running out of resources. They're running out of oil. So the future is unknown in terms of how strong Timor-Leste's democracy will remain. Alberto Fidalgo Castro wrote an interesting review of anthropological work in Timor-Leste following the referendum, when in the period of 1999 to 2002, it seemed like everybody needed to come in and publish some kind of article on Timor-Leste. It was the hot spot between the referendum and between essentially the 9/11 attacks in the United States, which then diverted everybody's attention. Some of the work was quite good, and some of it was somewhat lacking. Alberto writes about some of the better work. Andres de Castillo Sanchez, who's here with us, wrote about traditional authority and democracy in Timor-Leste. He's here and will speak after me, so I won't say much more about his work. And I wrote an article about Timor-Leste in the context of lobbying in the United States, the work of NGOs to lobby their respective governments in order to change policy. In the United States, this was particularly effective, and the United States was in a strong position to put pressure on Timor-Leste to change, or on Indonesia to change their policies towards Timor-Leste by, for example, stopping the sale of military hardware, aircraft, weapons, and training to Indonesia over the Timor-Leste issue. So I've written on several other topics related to Timor-Leste. I'll touch on some of these in my talk. My talk's going to be somewhat informal. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own research, sort of, Uncle Chris's guide to methodology of research in conflict zones. But some of these anecdotes are actually meaningful to the topic at hand and will illustrate larger points about the Indonesian occupation, for example. Written about tourism under the guise of solidarity as well. I went to Timor-Leste in this capacity in 1997, 98, and even early 99. In 1997, it was under the Suharto regime. This was a somewhat scary trip for me. It was my first trip to Indonesia, my first trip to Timor-Leste. I found territory that was under intense military occupation. There was a curfew. Nobody went out at night. I was told that if you venture onto the streets after dark, military vehicles would simply just hit you and kill you. And so the streets were empty at night. I met some people. I'll talk about them in a few minutes as well. I carried letters out of the territory to mail. And so I was part of this sort of solidarity tourism in Timor-Leste prior to the changes of 1998 and 1999. Timor-Leste gained its re-independence on May 20th, 2002, following the August 30, 1999 referendum and 2.5 years of a United Nations transitional period after the complete destruction of the country following the referendum in 1999. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's a re-independence because Timor-Leste declared its independence on the 28th of November, 1975, just prior to the Indonesian invasion of December 7th, 1975. The Timorese declared independence in the hopes that the world would recognize their sovereignty. Portugal was decolonizing after the Carnation Revolution. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And so the Timorese saw this as their moment to sort of seize independence. Indonesia had for a few months prior been entering the territory, creating conflict. It had gained access to one of the two major political parties and spread false rumors about a coup d'etat. And so the Timorese knew all of this and thought, this is our chance. If we declare independence, perhaps other countries will recognize us and Indonesia will be forced to call off their invasion. They knew the invasion was coming. After 24 years of brutal Indonesian occupation, again, I'll say more about this in a few minutes, the Timorese voted for independence in the referendum, only to have their country, as I mentioned, completely destroyed. Successful separatism is a very rare thing in this world. Ted Robert Gurr wrote several years ago of around 200 movements or groups of people who were sort of non-self-governing entities, many of which hosted separatist movements. But to them, for these movements to actually find success is very rare. Timor-Leste is one of them. Eritrea is another. South Sudan is another. It's very hard to think of examples where separatism actually succeeded. And so for Timor-Leste, it's a fantastic accomplishment as well. And if we think about Indonesia, there are other regions that host separatist movements such as West Papua and Aceh. It's also special in that despite years of suffering under 3 years of Japanese occupation during World War II, in which the population was reduced by about 1/10 and by about 1/3 during the Indonesian occupation, the Timorese have persevered and won their independence. My work has acknowledged groups like ETAN and others, but truly the most credit for the success of the Timorese obviously goes to the Timorese themselves, who lived through tremendous suffering and conflict, and now live in their own free, independent, and democratic country. Since I know that most people aren't too familiar with Timor-Leste, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the country relatively quickly. And as I said, I'm going to illustrate some points with some of the anecdotes of the work that I've done there. And like I said, maybe it'll be methodologically helpful if anybody plans on doing research in conflict or post-conflict zones. So this is the area that we're talking about. It's the small half island, the eastern half of the island of Timor, all the way to the east and south in Indonesia. There's also a small enclave called Dukusi, which isn't really visible on this map. So it's a tiny place. The population is around 1.3 million, which is, almost doubled in maybe the last 30 or 40 years. It's 97% Catholic. It's the most Catholic country in Southeast Asia, and definitely one of the most Catholic countries in the world. This is because of the Indonesian occupation. The Indonesians mandated that each Timorese choose a religion, and they chose Roman Catholicism. I'll talk about this in a few minutes with a slide. It's fantastic to think about, I think, even in sort of an anthropological or sociological way, that it's essentially 2 generations of Catholicism. In 1975, there was about 10%, or about 10% of the population was Catholic. And so this is a mass conversion to Catholicism. Their Catholicism is interesting as well. It of course, incorporates elements of what we would broadly call animism, ancestor worship, spiritism, etc., as we find throughout all of Southeast Asia. But in places like the Philippines, of course, Catholicism has centuries of history. In Timor-Leste, it's really only 2 generations or 3 generations. It's a poor country. The GDP per capita is around $4,000 US. And I should say that many people live subsistence agriculture. Just a few slides to give you an idea of where we're talking about. This is the capital city, Dili, which Andres could probably help me with this in terms of the population. I think it's around 200 or 250,000. So it's a huge population center with most of the other people spread out. Baucau is the 2nd largest city. And this is sort of a more familiar scene in the countryside, very sort of sparsely settled, very mountainous. Timor-Leste is very dry. There's maybe 1 rice crop a year as opposed to 2 or 3 in most other places in Indonesia. And during the rainy season, you get rivers that show up, but these rivers also will disappear for 9 months out of the year. A nod to the tourism industry, the current tourism industry in Timor-Leste. The beaches are fantastic. And as you see here, there's nobody there. Okay. It's a little bit different now, but it is still possible to go to some remote areas and find a beach with nobody for a kilometer or 2. Portuguese colonialism was marked by neglect. Right? The Portuguese were poor. They simply didn't have much in terms of resources to pour into their territory of Timor-Leste. The Portuguese as an empire declined very rapidly in sort of the 16th and 17th centuries. And they were able to sort of hold on to a few entrepôts such as Timor-Leste, Goa, Macau, et cetera, as well as, of course, some of their bigger colonies in Africa, Angola and Mozambique. Right? The Portuguese were after sandalwood and coffee. Sandalwood is an aromatic tree that the Portuguese essentially decimated in Timor-Leste. And by the 20th century, the stands of sandalwood were mostly gone, although there have been efforts to replant. And so the secondary crop was coffee. Timorese coffee is of a very fine quality, and due to negligence on the part of the Indonesians, they didn't send fertilizer, so it's also organic. So Timorese coffee is now sort of famous for being organic. Starbucks has a Timorese blend, for example, etc. Right. The Portuguese were less concerned than, say, the Spanish in terms of miscegenation, and so there was a lot of migration, maybe not a lot, but a good amount of migration back and forth between Timor-Leste and the other Portuguese colonies. And so you find in Timor-Leste today people of Angolan and Mozambique descent, people from other areas in Africa, Chinese, people who still have Portuguese blood, etc., as well as Indonesians. Right. There were frequent uprisings during the Portuguese colonial period, but these were mostly on a small scale. There was no large-scale nationalist movement in Timor-Leste until maybe the 1960s, but definitely emerging in the 1970s. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Japanese occupied Timor-Leste. It was the sort of stopping point for the Japanese before they got to Australia. Around 200 Australian commandos were sent to Timor-Leste in order to harass the Japanese and prevent them from making it to Australia. And around 1/10 of the population died, 1 out of every 10 people in this 3 years of Japanese occupation. I spoke at a conference a couple weeks ago in Seattle, and some of the people there were telling me that in interviews, the Timorese had said that the Japanese occupation was actually more disruptive, even though it was shorter, because the Japanese actually tried to disrupt the entire sort of social life of Timorese, whereas the Indonesians were attempting to sort of integrate them into Indonesia. This is a commemorative shrine to people killed in Ileo by the Japanese in 1942. Ileo is the town where I do most of my work. 1974, we had the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, sort of a left-wing military coup to replace the Salazar government and sort of begin the process of democratization. Part of that process was the Portuguese essentially saying, we are done with colonies, right? Part of the reason for the coup was the fact that the Portuguese military was fighting wars already in Angola and Mozambique, which had more developed nationalist movements, and they were losing money and they were losing lives. So it didn't make sense to them. Timor-Leste was an afterthought. There wasn't really a broad nationalist movement demanding independence at that time. And so it came as a little bit of a surprise. But the Timorese formed political parties. The two predominant parties were vastly in favor of independence, but differed over the timeline. And there was a very tiny pro-Indonesia party of a few hundred people, mostly wealthy landowners who thought they could gain by integrating with Indonesia. As I mentioned, Indonesia had a plan to subvert the Timorese politics. They were able to send agents in and spread false rumors of a coup d'etat in UDT versus Fretilin. And so there's a brief civil war. As I mentioned, they declared independence on the 28th of November, 1975, and Indonesia invaded about a week and a half later on December 7th, 1975. The invasion was brutal. By all accounts, Dili, the capital, was a free fire zone. Paratroopers landed, people landed by ship, Indonesian soldiers, they basically shot anything that moved. They shot in a reporter. I can't remember if he was British or Australian, so that news coverage would be minimized as well. And this lasted for several months and spread throughout the territory as Indonesia tried to gain control. It really didn't gain control until 1981, although there was a guerrilla resistance movement that lasted throughout the entire occupation. There were mass killings, the most notorious in 1991 at the cemetery of Santa Cruz that was captured on film and broadcast, but there are reports of other mass killings throughout the occupation. Rape and forced injection of Depo-Provera and even surgical sterilization of women occurred as well. I'll talk about that in a minute. Starvation as well. The Timorese were forced to come down from the mountains and live in camps that the Indonesians built, taking them away from their food sources and also spreading disease. So roughly 1/3 of the population died. The official number in the Shega report is 100,000 out of 600,000, but they acknowledge that it could be as high as 180 or even more. Regardless, that's 1/6 of the population to 1/4 or 1/3. On the upper left, you see President Gerald Ford and President Suharto of Indonesia, and the bottom left of that is Henry Kissinger. Ford and Kissinger were in Jakarta on December 6th, 1975, the day before the invasion, and asked Suharto, please wait one day so that we can leave Indonesian airspace before you invade. As they were leaving the Indonesian airspace is when the invasion occurred. Kissinger made secret promises to Suharto and to funnel arms to Indonesia so that they could carry out the invasion and occupation. This went against American congressional intent. But Kissinger famously said that, it was, millions and millions of Indonesians who were anti-communist that mattered much more than at that point around 500,000 Timorese. There were false rumors of communism in Timor-Leste. The nationalists were definitely leftist and geared towards socialism, but there was no cooperation with China, Russia, North Vietnam, any of that. These were all rumors that were spread that were false. And then we see the Indonesians invading and their result in the camps. The Indonesian occupation, Indonesians claimed that the occupation was good for the Timorese because they were building infrastructure, as though killing 1 out of every 3 people could be justified by building roads. The roads, by the way, facilitated the military occupation. It allowed the military to go throughout the territory. They created programs of education and Indonesian-style education and schools as a way to inculcate Indonesian values in Timorese children, hopefully to convert the next generation. It didn't work. They also claimed they were economically developing Timor-Leste, although most of the businesses owned in Timor-Leste were owned by the Indonesian generals, such as Benny Murdani, who had a monopoly on things like marble extraction, et cetera. Right. And then, as I mentioned, this huge conversion to Catholicism. So I wanted to take a quick pause and talk about my friend and the father of the family that I stayed with during the referendum, a man by the name of Mario Mesquita, who's here in that picture to my right, and his wife Maria and their son Nono. They have 4 other children as well. Mario, during the invasion or prior to the invasion, was a police officer for the Portuguese colonial police. When Indonesia invaded, he fled to the hills and became a guerrilla fighter for Falentil, the armed resistance against the Indonesians. After a while, he came down from the hills and resettled back in his hometown of Ileo, and was asked by the Indonesians, since he had a history of being a police officer, would he be an Indonesian police officer? And he said, yes. This was an offer you couldn't refuse. To say no would invite suspicion, right? So there are a lot of Timorese who, on the surface, worked with Indonesians, but were still working with the resistance. Mario was one of them. Eventually, he was asked to be the head of a village. So when I was there in 1999, Mario was a village head of a small village just outside of Ileo, but working with the underground resistance and hosting us, international observers, which put him and his family at great danger. During the referendum, his house was attacked and burned to the ground. His family escaped to Dili. We took them in a van, but Mario stayed behind and saw. He told me he was across the street when his house was being burned down and looted. He had a hand grenade and was going to throw it into his own house to kill the people doing this, but he recognized that some of the people weren't really with the militias. They were being forced into this. And he said, I didn't do it. So he contracted malaria and eventually came down and resettled after the Australians and the International Force for Timor-Leste came in and secured the territory. He was then asked by the UN to be a police officer. So Mario was a police officer for the United Nations. After 2002, he was asked he joined the Timorese police force. So Mario was a police for the Portuguese, the Indonesians, the UN, and Portugal. because of his history, his work as a guerrilla, and his history as a police officer, he's a very well-respected person in the community. He's also a fantastic guy. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the church. I've published on this as well. So as I mentioned, the Timorese turned to Catholicism because because Indonesia basically forced them to choose one world religion, Protestantism, Catholicism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or Islam. They didn't want to choose Islam because that was the predominant religion of the invader. They didn't want to choose Protestantism because the Protestant church in Indonesia was sort of co-opted by the state. They chose Catholicism because of its traditional role in Timor-Leste as a means for people to get education, and also because of the status of the church and sort of the pro-Portuguese orientation of the church. Many of the priests in the initial years of the Indonesian occupation were Portuguese, although they were eventually replaced by predominantly Timorese priests. And the church provided a means for the Timorese to gather and congregate, something that had been banned by Indonesia. It allowed them to speak their own language. It offered protection for boys. So I was traveling from Ainaro to Swai and was told that we stopped and pulled over, and there was a cliff, and was told that this cliff is called Jakarta. And I said, why is this cliff called Jakarta? I said, well, the Indonesians would go to Timorese houses where there were young boys, say between the ages of 12, 14, 15, and they would say, your son's got a scholarship to go study in Jakarta. And they would kidnap him and throw him off the cliff because they essentially wanted to get rid of the next generation of guerrilla fighters, right? And so this cliff was, in sort of black humor, was called Jakarta, right? The church provided a safe haven. So in 1997, when I went, the church in Baucau, for example, had a compound where young boys would live. And it was a way that the church could protect young boys and young men of Timor-Leste. So the church had a fairly significant role during the Indonesian occupation and remains important and relevant in Timorese politics to this day. And as we see, as I mentioned, it's 2 generations or 3 generations of Catholicism. And so the church also sort of, I don't know if tolerate is the right word, but coexists with pre-existing Timorese beliefs. And so this is a model of a traditional Timorese house that's set up right in front of a Catholic church. So I first went in this period of Indonesian occupation in January of 1997. I stayed at this hotel back then called the Hotel Flamboyant in Baucau. I didn't know, but just a few years prior, it was a center for Indonesian torture. And they had recently converted it back to a hotel. My window didn't lock, and it kind of freaked me out. I was, I didn't sleep very well that night. But part of the reason I didn't sleep is because that day I went for a walk and met a man named Gilles just down the street. He invited me to his house, which was very rare. Timorese avoided me during this trip because to be caught talking to a Westerner was to invite suspicion, and to have suspicion heaped on you could mean that you could be kidnapped, tortured, imprisoned, or even killed or disappeared. Gilles, however, talked to me for a few minutes and said, meet me at the church at midnight and we'll talk. And I said, okay. And so I snuck out at midnight. Remember, there's a curfew. So I was looking over my shoulder, trying to make it to the church without being caught by the Indonesian police. And I made it. And I talked to Gilles for about an hour and a half or 2. And he was working in the hospital. And what he had done was compiled a list of people who the doctors had killed in the hospital. So if you were suspected of being sympathetic to the guerrillas or to the resistance, and you went to the hospital for treatment, they would kill you. And he had a list, pages and pages and pages of people who had been killed. This is one of the reasons why the Timorese avoided going to hospitals for treatment, and was sort of created the secondary effect of people dying of treatable maladies during the occupation. Gilles also had a list of women who had been sterilized against their consent, given injections of Depo-Provera or surgically sterilized. So needless to say, this is something I had heard before I went, but meeting and talking to somebody who actually had a record of this really made it sort of concrete. I thought I had another. Well, I think I've got another slide of Gilles. Gilles made it through the referendum period and is now a dentist. He drives a van that's sponsored by the Portuguese government and goes and does dental visits in the surrounding community. I should say, Gilles was involved with the resistance. Mario was involved with the resistance. And one of the things in doing interviews for this work I did on tourism, I found out or was told, and I actually kind of already knew, it was reinforced that just about everybody was involved with the resistance. Around 80% of the population voted for independence. It would have been more had there not been the harassment by the Indonesian security forces. So it's not as though it was difficult to see who was pro-independence. It was the vast majority of people. The international solidarity movement for Timor-Leste really took off in 1991. There were already a few existing organizations in Canada and England, but it was the United States, the East Timor Action Network that formed in 1991, Japan, Thailand, Australia, etc., because there was a video of an Indonesian massacre in which a couple hundred people were killed and around a total of 400 people died in the days following. Some of these people were brought to hospitals and were killed in hospitals. Right? It was broadcast on the news throughout the world, so people could actually see the violence and see what people were going through in Timor-Leste. Remember, this is also in the context of the end of the Cold War. So supporting Indonesia in the name of anti-communism no longer held water, and issues like human rights were becoming more important in sort of international dialogue, right? There was pressure on Indonesia. And with the East Asian economic crisis of 1997, 1998, Suharto abdicated. B.J. Habibie, his vice president, became president and actually agreed to a United Nations overseen referendum to take place in 1999. As I mentioned, around 80% voted for independence, but Indonesia had sponsored militias, and they went on rampages of violence prior to and after the referendum. So in thinking about solidarity, we also think about Jose Ramos Horta and Bishop Bello here on the upper left, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996. This was a big push for Timorese solidarity throughout the world. Upper right is me with Shenana Gusmao, former guerrilla leader who was East Timor's first president and second prime minister, and some other Timorese politicians, Tawar Matanruak, below, and Mari Alkatiri, who was the first prime minister, notably because he's of Yemeni descent and a Muslim in a 97% Catholic country. I think Tawar Matanruak is Protestant as well. And so we have the events leading up to the referendum. We have rallies such as this. The underground came above ground in early 1999. Organizations such as the CNRM or the CNRT, the National Council of Timorese Resistance, student groups such as Renatil, all came above ground and were active, right? This was a sort of open campaigning period where the pro-Indonesia side had one day to campaign, and the next day the pro-independent side would campaign. People went to the pro-Indonesia campaigns because if you didn't, you were marked as being a sympathizer, right? So the pro-Indonesia campaigns were full of people, which probably gave the Indonesian government the idea that they had a lot of support. They did not, but people went because they had to. If you weren't seen at the pro-Indonesia rally, then you were sort of marked for suspicion. The Indonesians also gave away rice, T-shirts, they allowed gambling, and they gave away liquor. They had bands, right? So it was, it was entertaining as well. This is a group of people just outside of Ileo. The man in the center is holding a plate of rice, and the men are drunk. If you can see in the picture, they're pretty drunk. But they said they had just come from a pro-Indonesia rally, and the man holding the rice said, "The rice is from Indonesia, but our hearts are for independence." Sort of reinforcing this idea that they were willing and able to take these gifts that were given at the rallies and yet remain independent. And in the pro-Timorese side, it was an interesting juxtaposition of modern and traditional, right? You sort of have a guy wearing a jacket and a tie representing the CNRT standing next to somebody in traditional garb, both campaigning for Timorese independence. And there was this period of campaigning for a couple of weeks up to the referendum, and then I think it was 2 days of cooling off before the actual vote. There was a couple things that I wanted to mention. I talked about the militias that were sponsored by Indonesia. They actually imported people from other parts of Indonesia into Timor and claimed that they were Timorese. This was brought home to me when I was going, this is during the referendum, but a few days prior, I went to this village to investigate a burned down house with a couple people from my group. We were stopped by a militia post by men who were brandishing machetes. And they literally said to us, "We are going to kill you." And they got me, the two other international observers out of the car. Our driver was Timorese, and they were speaking to him, saying the same thing. I speak Indonesian, so I could understand what they were saying. And then there were two Indonesian special forces soldiers. My United Nations accredited ID said that the police and the military had to protect us in this situation. I walked over to them and said, "These guys are threatening to kill us. What are you going to do?" They laughed at me and turned around and walked away. And they were going to let it happen. And our driver was speaking to them in Tetum, the lingua franca of Timor-Leste, and Mumbai, which is the local dialect in that region of Timor-Leste. They didn't understand them at all. And so our driver was telling me, "These guys are not Timorese. I have no idea where they're from." Luckily, an Australian civilian police officer came by. They were unarmed, but authoritative. And this guy was probably 6'8", over 2 meters tall, huge guy. And I explained to him what was going on. And he separated us and said, "You guys go, you militia guys, don't kill them." And there you go. And so we escaped. After the referendum, the militias went wild. And they shot a man in the head about 100 yards from where I was staying. We were celebrating a birthday the day after the referendum, and we went and took him away. He wasn't dead. And the American Maryknoll nuns who were in the earlier slide came and got him, treated him at the clinic. He survived, so I've seen him since. But our house was immediately surrounded by the militia, and the police came. And we thought, great, the police are going to protect us. Here we go. But the police were sharing cigarettes with the militia members. One of them took off his jacket and gave the cop a militia jacket to wear. So we knew that we were no longer safe. And that's when we evacuated to Dili from Ileo. The next day, we were investigating a burned down house in Dili, and that's when people started pointing rifles at us. And we took shelter in a convent, and there was a street battle between the militias and the Timorese defenders right in front of us. And the nuns said, come inside, we have CNN. And it was an absolutely bizarre situation where we would hear an explosion on the street just in front of us, and then 3 seconds later, hear it on CNN. CNN was covering the violence live. It was quite bizarre. And then I made it out a few days later. I went back in early January of 2000 on a Red Cross flight to see the aftermath of the referendum and to work with an NGO called Timor Aid. My job was to count houses that were burned down in faraway districts. And the Indonesians literally destroyed 80% of everything: buildings, roads, infrastructure, telephone, water system. They killed livestock, they burned crops, they stole televisions, they stole vehicles. They forced some 200,000 Timorese at gunpoint into other places of Indonesia. So when I came back, it was as though an atomic bomb had gone off. So the capital of Dili was destroyed. Very few buildings left standing. And when I went to investigate in faraway regions, these are places where you had to walk an hour or so before away from the road. 8 out of 10 huts were burned down, right? So this was a coordinated scorched earth campaign. This is in Ainaro. So remember, this is just a couple months after the referendum in January of 2000. This little girl had her house burned down, but her parents had churned the ashes into the soil and planted corn. So they were taking advantage of the fertility of the ashes in order to start rebuilding their lives. And again, in Ainaro, these boys were singing in a church because Bishop Bello was coming to visit. And, most of them had the clothes that were on their back, and that's about it, because everything had been taken away from them. And you started to see Falentil, the guerrilla resistance, come out above ground. This is by the marker that lets you know you've come to Ileo. And it was strange knowing that this guy looks pretty young, but there were guerrillas who had been fighting for 25 years who had come out. And these are mostly now, well, most of the political leaders now are of that generation, and many of them were actually guerrillas. So in this period between 1999 and 2002 that the UN administered, as I mentioned, there was a scorched earth policy before Indonesia left. So the UN was sort of there to pick up the pieces from the ashes that were left. There was a formation of parliament. Political parties sort of started to form and vie. There were accusations of neo-imperialism on the part of Australia and others. Australia made it very clear they wanted the oil in the Timor Sea Gap, but also the United Nations was seen as being aloof at this point in time. They stayed in their buildings. They didn't mix much with Timorese. And I'll show you an illustration of that. This was a hotel ship that was brought from either Hong Kong or the Philippines, but Timorese weren't allowed on it unless they were bartenders or maids. And so one night I said, screw that. I'm bringing one of my Timorese friends onto the boat. And we went onto the boat, and he was very uncomfortable because the Westerners who were on the boat were all staring at him. Right? They were in his country and making him feel uncomfortable. Right. So there was definitely in this early period a feeling of sort of aloofness. The Timorese resented some of what the United Nations was doing. Jarrett Chopra, who was a senior UN bureaucrat, wrote an article called the UN's Kingdom of East Timor, saying that the UN had set themselves up as completely sovereign with no heirs of democracy in this period. Despite all of that, the United Nations actually did a very good job. They prepared the country for a transition. They made a transition in May 20, 2002. And as I said, they've remained very democratic since. In all sorts of measurements, Timor-Leste is the most democratic country of Southeast Asia. Freedom of the press, for example, the freedom or the way they run their elections, et cetera, right? There are some threats to that. The Timorese have been trying to pass laws that limit the way people can demonstrate, et cetera, but it's still, compared to their neighbors, they remain very democratic. There have been bouts of violence in the past, most notably an attempt to assassinate the president and the prime minister in 2008, street violence, unemployment, et cetera. But that was sort of the most serious hiccup after independence. And it's been, I don't know if I want to say completely smooth, but it hasn't been violent in the way that it was in that year. Part of it was due to military dissatisfaction. People from the eastern part of the island are seen as more supporting independence. People from the west are seen as more pro-Indonesia. And so the military was arguing that people from the east were getting promotions and people from the west weren't. And that's one of the things that led to this violence. And of course, it remains a very poor country. We have the current president on the left, Jose Ramos Horta, and the current prime minister, who was the former president, Taur Matan Ruak, or Jose Maria Vasconcelos. Jose Ramos Horta is fairly famous. He won the Nobel Prize in 1996. He was sort of the diplomat in exile for Timor-Leste, living in Australia, New York, and elsewhere, and he wrote a book and sort of kept the Timorese vision of independence alive, and was sort of the face of sort of diplomatic Timor-Leste. And some of the other leaders, Taur Matan Ruak on the bottom right, Xanana Gusmão upper right and upper left, and Jose Ramos Horta, right? Xanana Gusmão has been noted to have a resemblance to Che Guevara as well. And during the referendum, people were wearing Che t-shirts or Xanana t-shirts, and both of them angered the Indonesian military because, of course, they were anti-communist. I saw an Australian observer wearing a Che shirt, and I said, you need to take that off, right? Because if you're an observer, you have to be neutral. And that's it. I'll leave it at that. I'm very happy to entertain questions. And this is a girl, Celia, I met in January of 2000, took her picture at the beach just because she was a pretty young girl, but also representing sort of the future of Timor-Leste. The population is predominantly young. And as I mentioned before, their oil is running out, but we'll see what happens for the future of Timor-Leste. And thank you.
Muchas gracias, Chris. Pues es imposible escuchar la conferencia del profesor Laundrie y permanecer, ¿no?, más o menos indiferente al asunto. En particular, bueno, a ver, yo mismo tuve la fortuna de poder realizar trabajo de campo en Timor-Leste hace unos pocos años. Por cierto, nos quedamos en el mismo hotel en Baucau. que afortunadamente está en muy buena condición y tiene un pequeño museo de su historia colorida. Y en efecto, digo, a ver, yo soy moderador y no me toca comerme más el tiempo. Además, quiero darles oportunidad para poder plantear preguntas, pero mucho del testimonio que nos está ofreciendo Chris, que pareciera, ¿no?, que ya quedó 10 o 15 o 20 años en el pasado, pues muchos de esos rastros siguen estando ahí presentes, ¿no? Y mucha de la gente que fue testigo y actores de estos tiempos ahí siguen, muchos de ellos todavía activos en gobierno, en la iglesia. Nosotros, mi red de colegas de investigación, todos fuimos asistidos por católicos, ¿no? Por una red de infraestructura católica que es la única que realmente sigue funcionando en sitios más remotos, ¿no? Los Palos y demás. Bueno, voy a abrir entonces y bueno, no, perdón, claro. Vamos a pasar ahora a la respuesta y comentario de nuestro colega y exalumno que tenemos el honor de tener aquí presente, a pesar de que está casi del otro lado del mundo. Andrés del Castillo. Andrés, muchas gracias por estar ahí, tener el interés y la paciencia de aguantarnos, a pesar de lo tarde que debe de ser ahorita, ¿no?, en donde estás. Bien, pues a ver, me da muchísimo gusto y es un honor presentar a Andrés del Castillo Sánchez, que es ahora asesor en jefe y gerente del proyecto de apoyo electoral del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, el PNUD, en Mozambique desde enero de 2019. Previo a ese puesto, Andrés del Castillo se desempeñó como asesor en jefe y gerente del proyecto de apoyo electoral de la PNUD en la República Democrática de Timor-Leste, siendo el único extranjero que ha participado en la formación del sistema electoral de Timor-Leste y en todos los procesos electorales de ese país desde la consulta popular de 1999, que llevó a la independencia de Timor hasta las elecciones de 2018, un total de 22 elecciones. En 2010, el presidente José Ramos Horta y el gobierno de Timor-Leste le otorgaron la medalla al mérito por su aporte al desarrollo de la democracia en el país. Ha sido asesor en jefe y gerente del proyecto de apoyo electoral del PNUD en Nepal durante 4 años, periodo en el cual participó en la organización de las elecciones de la Asamblea Constituyente. Participó como asesor en el referéndum para la independencia de Sudán del Sur y en la auditoría de las elecciones presidenciales de Afganistán de 2014. Recientemente fue gerente interino del proyecto de apoyo al registro de personas en Honduras. Tiene 20 años de experiencia en proyectos de la ONU, misiones de la ONU y en áreas tales como apoyo electoral, legislación electoral, registro de electores, educación cívica y electoral, capacitación electoral y operaciones electorales, entre otros. Andrés del Castillo es candidato a doctor en estudios de Asia y África por el Colegio de México, maestro en estudios de Asia y África con especialidad de sureste asiático por el Colegio de México y licenciado en Relaciones Internacionales, graduado con mención honorífica por la UNAM. Habla español, inglés, portugués, Bahasa Indonesia, Tetum, de Timor-Leste, como se había comentado Chris, e italiano. Y es un honor, Andrés. Muchas gracias. Tienes tú la palabra.
Bueno, primeramente, muchísimas gracias al Colegio de México por invitarnos, concretamente a Cris. Muchas gracias por invitarnos a formar parte de este panel el día de hoy. Igualmente, muchas gracias a los colegas y compañeros del Centro de Estudios de Asia y África. Y concretamente quiero agradecer también al profesor John Marston, porque en el lejano 1997, cuando se abrió por primera vez el programa de estudios del sureste de Asia en el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África, tuve la oportunidad de ser parte de la primera generación de estudios del sureste de Asia en el Colegio de México, y el profesor John Marston fue la persona que nos acercó a esta región del mundo, y concretamente junto con el profesor Juan José Ramírez Bonilla y la profesora Efi Siregar. En el año fue muy interesante porque desde 1997 yo mostré interés por hacer mi tesis de maestría sobre Timor-Leste, sin saber que Timor-Leste se convertiría en un país independiente al poco tiempo. Realmente era un fenómeno que nosotros no veíamos que pudiera ser real. En el año de 1999, cuando se llamó el referéndum, a la consulta popular para decidir el futuro del territorio, tuve la oportunidad de participar como funcionario de Naciones Unidas, y fue mi primer acercamiento a Timor. Yo llegué a Timor cuando aún estaba bajo la administración de Indonesia, y permanecí ahí hasta puedo decir, hasta casi hoy en día, donde aún tengo mi casa, mi residencia está en Timor-Leste. Aún tenemos hoy allá en Timor-Leste, en Dili, tenemos yo y mi pareja, tenemos el consulado honorario de México en Dili, que es el consulado honorario más lejano de territorio nacional que existe entre los consulados honorarios de México. Y bueno, tuve la oportunidad de, como se mencionó al inicio en mis semblantes, de permanecer en el país y formar parte de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas. Posteriormente ya salí de Timor y estuve en algunos lugares, pero siempre regresando a Timor. La breve presentación que voy a hacer se complementa con la presentación de Cris que hizo hoy, que es muy totalmente, va en paralelo. Yo lo que hice fue retomé algunos pasajes de mi tesis de maestría que está en Colegio de México, que habla sobre la formación de la identidad nacional en Timor-Leste. Y quise retomar algunos puntos concretos para demostrar lo complicado que ha sido la formación de la identidad nacional en Timor-Leste, en un país recientemente, y lo complicado que ha sido crear un Estado-nación en Timor. Voy a comenzar a compartir mi pantalla. Por favor, díganme si la pueden ver. ¿Se puede ver?
Sí, sí.
Ok. Déjame ver. Déjame slideshow. Ok. ¿Dónde viene? Ok. Bueno, en ocasión de los 20 años de la reindependencia de Timor-Leste. Mis slides están en inglés y mi presentación la voy a hacer en español, pero se pueden ir siguiendo porque voy a ir siguiendo lo que está escrito en inglés y lo voy a ir hablando en español. Entonces tenemos los dos idiomas. Primeramente tendremos la formación de la identidad Timor-Leste. Aquí yo retomé, como les dije, de mi tesis de maestría, algunos elementos breves que son básicos elementos para la formación de la identidad nacional en Timor-Leste, y quise problematizar la situación de la adopción de un idioma nacional del idioma como lengua nacional, el problema de la religión como también otro elemento para la formación de la identidad nacional, la creación de una historia nacional, la creación del mito maubere y el papel de las comunidades de las autoridades comunitarias. Aquí, por ejemplo, ilustración que estoy poniendo es una escultura tradicional de la isla de Atauro, enfrente de Dili, que es una representación de las genealogías. Podemos ver las figuras mayores son los abuelos y la figura que viene abajo son los hijos, y viene entonces en una misma escultura se van presentando las diferentes genealogías y las diferentes de una familia. Quise elegir esta ilustración para ilustrar la formación de la identidad nacional de Timor-Leste. Como ya presenté, como ya lo presentó Chris, y no voy a repetir lo que ya dijo, pero voy a probablemente aumentar algunas informaciones que nos ayuden a entender lo complicado que puede ser la situación de Timor-Leste, y empezando por la situación geográfica. Como bien lo presentó en su mapa Chris, podemos ver que Timor es la última isla de una serie de islas que vienen desde la península de Malasia, y es la última, la más oriental de las islas, y por eso de ahí viene el nombre de Timor, que Timor en Bahasa significa oriente. Es la isla más oriental del archipiélago, y más cercana a Australia y ya a la parte melanésica. En la isla está la República Democrática de Timor-Leste, ocupa la parte oriental de la isla, y sin embargo tiene un enclave en la parte occidental, y es interesante saber que estas fronteras fueron totalmente artificiales, producto del periodo colonial. De hecho, las fronteras fueron trazadas en el siglo XIX entre Holanda y Portugal, que eran las potencias coloniales en la época, y quedó un enclave en la parte occidental del territorio, en el cual es el territorio de Ambeno, y curiosamente la principal motivo por el cual se mantuvo como territorio portugués en ese momento y hasta hoy en día como territorio de la República Democrática de Timor-Leste, porque fue el primer lugar al cual llegaron los portugueses en Oecusi. Al haber llegado los portugueses al territorio de Oecusi en el siglo XVI, ellos en sus negociaciones en el siglo XIX pidieron que ese territorio se mantuviera bajo la bandera del imperio portugués, y por ese motivo se mantuvo, pero no existe ningún otro motivo, ni étnico, ni ningún otro tipo político para el cual esté dividido, se encuentre este enclave en la parte occidental. Tenemos la isla de Atauro, que está enfrente, una pequeña isla enfrente de Dili, y la última, la isla de Yaco, que es el último territorio insular que está en la parte oriental. El territorio es pequeño. Para tener una idea de lo que estamos hablando, si lo comparamos con México, es del tamaño, el territorio de la República Democrática de Timor Oriental, de Timor-Leste, es del tamaño del estado de Tabasco, y si lo ponemos a nivel internacional es el tamaño de la República de El Salvador, alrededor de 19,000 kilómetros cuadrados. En un territorio tan pequeño como es el de en esto, es muy interesante ver cómo se conviven diferentes grupos etnolingüísticos. Y aquí es en donde hablamos sobre el siguiente punto, el problema lingüístico. Cuando empezamos a ver que para la formación de la identidad nacional no tenemos un idioma nacional que realmente sea el idioma común en todo el territorio. La lengua franca fue en un tiempo el tetum, pero una lengua franca que no es hablada, no lo tiene como lengua madre más del 36.6% de la población. Quiere decir que tenemos un 66%, un 64% que no tienen el tetum como idioma materno. Cuando se decidió después de la independencia, cuando se estuvo redactando la Constitución, se decidió elegir dos idiomas nacionales. Los dos idiomas nacionales que fueron elegidos fue el tetum y el portugués. El portugués como el antiguo idioma colonial y el tetum como un idioma local. Pero al momento de la independencia hay que tomar en cuenta que el tetum no era un idioma que estaba desarrollado lingüísticamente, no tenía una ortografía, no tenía una gramática definida y de hecho no se escribía, era un idioma principalmente oral, pero se decidió ponerlo como idioma nacional para parte de la formación de la identidad del país. El portugués fue seleccionado para hacer las leyes. La primera constitución está en portugués y a partir de ese momento las leyes y el portugués rigen desde el punto de vista jurídico en el país, aunque a pesar de todo el tiempo, hoy en día el portugués no se habla totalmente, hay una pequeña minoría que lo habla, se ha tratado de imponer en la educación el portugués, es un idioma muy complicado, especialmente el portugués, la gramática es parecida a una gramática de origen latino como el español, comparado con la gramática del tetum, que es un idioma austronésico con una gramática totalmente diferente, se les dificulta mucho al pueblo timorense realmente aprender el portugués. Y hoy por hoy, a pesar del gran esfuerzo y el apoyo que ha hecho Portugal, que ha hecho Brasil, intentando retomar el portugués, es realmente, no, tiene un poco de éxito, pero realmente muy breve. Por otro lado, en la propia Constitución se aceptó la utilización de otras dos idiomas, el bahasa indonesio y el inglés como idioma de apoyo administrativo. Cuando yo llegué en el año de 1999, realmente solo algunos grupos de ancianos hablaban portugués, casi no se hablaba el portugués, la mayoría de la población hablaba el bahasa indonesio, y el inglés obviamente se empezó a utilizar como idioma de las Naciones Unidas en el país. Es muy interesante ver cómo después de más de 20 y tantos años ha evolucionado la situación y hoy por hoy el bahasa indonesia está perdiendo muchísimo lugar en la República Democrática de Timor-Leste. Los jóvenes ya no hablan el bahasa, a pesar de que hace 20 años era el idioma más difundido en todo el país. Es raro ya en las escuelas, salvo en alguna universidad, alguna facultad, se da en bahasa indonesio. La educación, insisto, se está dando en portugués, pero en realidad se maneja también mucho el tetum. Ahora, tenemos una serie de 15, bueno, los números varían si hablamos entre lenguas, idiomas, dialectos, pero alrededor entre 15 y algunos investigadores lingüistas hablan hasta de 30 diferentes variantes lingüísticas en el país. Pero tenemos, por ejemplo, el tetum que se ha elegido como idioma nacional, que es el tetum prasa, es el tetum de Dili, que es el tetum que se utiliza en la ciudad de Dili y que es el tetum que incorpora muchas palabras del portugués cuando no se tiene la terminología. En el año 99, cuando yo estuve allá, nosotros participamos en la elaboración del primer glosario de derechos humanos en inglés, portugués, tetum y bahasa. Y teníamos el gran problema que en tetum no existen muchas de las palabras occidentales para denominar algunos de la terminología de derechos humanos, o simplemente palabras como democracia, elecciones, no existen en tetum. Entonces se entra en esta discusión de cuál es la lengua que se utiliza como referencia para incorporar palabras no existentes. Hay dos corrientes, existe en la Universidad de Timor-Leste, existen dos corrientes, una utilizar palabras de origen bahasa, de bahasa indonesio, o palabras de portugués. Y la versión que se ha utilizado es utilizar palabras de origen portugués. Es decir, cuando no existe una palabra en la lengua tetum, se toma la referencia de una palabra en portugués. Por ejemplo, elección, eleição en portugués, se dice en tetum eleição también, pero con una grafía similar a fonética y no a la del idioma portugués. Entonces tenemos el portugués que se habla en Tetum, pues el portugués que se está estandarizando y se está, perdón, el Tetum se está estandarizando y se está utilizando como el idioma nacional, el Tetum Dili. Existe el Tetum Terik, que es el Tetum más puro, sin influencia occidental, y que se habla principalmente en Timor Occidental y se habla en las regiones fronterizas. Y tenemos las otras idiomas, el Mambay, Macasay, Baikeno, Kemak, Bunak, Tocodede, Fatuluco, etc. Es interesante ver, y como yo decía en la slide anterior, el territorio es muy pequeño, pero para un territorio tan pequeño, tener esta variedad lingüística, inclusive para idiomas que provienen de una raíz diferente, unos son austronésicos y otros son de origen melanésico o papúa, que no se entienden entre unos a otros. Sin embargo, el hecho geográfico también, y que lo mencioné en la slide anterior, el hecho de tener las montañas. Tenemos un territorio muy pequeño que va del nivel del mar a montañas de casi 3.000 metros sobre el nivel del mar, con una serie de valles y montañas internas. Eso provocó que se crearan islas lingüísticas en el territorio y en el cual tenemos algunos grupos que hablan idiomas como el Macasay o como el Bunak, que son de origen melanésico, y otros que son de otro origen. Y entonces son totalmente diferentes. Es como decir un idioma de origen latino con un idioma de origen chino o totalmente diferente. No se entienden. Realmente esto ha sido un gran problema para la formación de la identidad nacional y la administración del país. Inclusive son problemas muy prácticos entre el idioma a elegir. Hoy en día, después de 20 años, el Tetum se está estandarizando y se está estableciendo más. Sin embargo, aún se mantiene este problema. Y se mantiene el problema de mantener el portugués como idioma oficial, porque, insisto, hoy en día toda la cuestión jurídica, todo el sistema jurídico del país, las leyes, es en idioma portugués que muchas veces no lo entiende la población. La religión, y voy a hacer un poco de mención a lo que dijo Chris en su presentación. Es muy interesante ver cómo en el último censo portugués, en el año de 1970, aproximadamente de un 10 a un 15% de la población se consideraban católicos. Quiere decir que la mayoría de la población no se consideraba católico. Sin embargo, después de la invasión de Indonesia del año 75, y como bien lo mencionó Chris, se forzó a la población a elegir una de las 5 religiones oficiales reconocidas por el Estado indonesio, que son el hinduismo, el islam, el budismo, el catolicismo, el protestantismo. La mayoría de la población en Timor-Leste practicaba religiones tradicionales, pues las llamadas animistas, y al tener que elegir una de estas 5 religiones en las cuales no se mencionaba no aparecía el animismo o algo que pusiera, la población comenzó a elegir el catolicismo. Entonces es muy interesante que al primer censo realizado en Timor después de la invasión indonesia en el año de 1980, ya brincó de menos de un 10-15% de población católica a un 90-95% de la población católica. Es decir, lo que no logró la colonia portuguesa en 500 años, lo logró la administración indonesia en 5 o 7 años, lo logró. Es muy interesante el papel que tuvo la Iglesia Católica también en la formación de la identidad nacional. La Iglesia Católica se constituyó como uno de los elementos durante el periodo de dominación indonesia que mantuvo la identidad nacional. Y a los indonesios comenzaron a limitar el uso del idioma portugués, se prohibió la educación en portugués, salvo un caso aislado en la ciudad de Dili que tenemos, pero casi nada se prohibió. Y las misas, la liturgia de la Iglesia Católica se promovió que se diera o en Bahasa Indonesia o en el idioma que era conocido en indonesio como Bahasa Daerah, el idioma local, el Tetum. Entonces aquí tenemos la conjunción de la religión con el idioma nacional. Tenemos el catolicismo por un lado y el idioma nacional, el Tetum. El idioma del Tetum se empieza a incorporar a la religión, se traduce la Biblia al Tetum, la liturgia de la misa se hace en Tetum y el Tetum comienza a difundirse a nivel nacional en todo el país a través de la Iglesia Católica. Es muy interesante que la Iglesia Católica desde Roma también nunca aceptó que la diócesis de Dili se incorporara a la Conferencia Episcopal de Indonesia. La diócesis de Dili dependía directamente de Roma, no dependía el obispo de Dili no formaba parte durante el periodo indonesio de la Conferencia Episcopal Indonesia. Eso a través de una bula del Papa Pablo VI, ad nominum, en el cual hace que se mantenga como un caso especial y de este modo la Iglesia Católica no está de hecho reconociendo la incorporación del territorio de Indonesia, del territorio de Timor a Indonesia. Finalmente tenemos algunos eventos muy anecdóticos, como puede ser la llegada del Papa, la visita del Papa Juan Pablo II en 1989 a territorio de Timor-Leste, en el cual todos recordaremos el hecho simbólico cuando el Papa Juan Pablo llegaba a un país, lo primero que hacía, se hincaba y besaba el territorio en señal de respeto al territorio que estaba llegando. El Papa, cuando llega a Indonesia, se hinca en Yakarta y besa el territorio de Indonesia. Cuando llega a Timor, se hinca en Dili y besa el territorio de Timor-Leste, pasando una señal de cuál era para la Iglesia Católica, cómo consideraba este territorio. Obviamente esto hizo que el pueblo y que fuera un elemento muy cercano la Iglesia Católica, la resistencia contra la invasión. Hecho que fue enarbolado por el obispo de Dili, Carlos Jiménez Bello. Carlos Jiménez Bello, que en el año 96 ganó el Premio Nobel de la Paz junto con José Ramos Horta y que, por cierto, recientemente está envuelto en un problema de un escándalo sexual y que ha afectado mucho su reputación, pero aún así se mantiene, es uno de los líderes más reconocidos, el obispo Jiménez Bello, porque él nunca salió del territorio, a diferencia de la élite timorense que salió del territorio y se refugió en Australia, se refugió en Mozambique, se refugió en Portugal. Don Carlos Jiménez Bello nunca salió del territorio. Tenemos después, let me see, la parte de una historia común. Una historia común también se ha intentado crear hoy en día una historia común en el país. Se comienzan a restaurar algunas figuras históricas, como la historia de 1912 del Liurai Don Boaventura, que era un rey local que se levantó contra la administración portuguesa por unos asuntos de impuestos. Sin embargo, se está restaurando hoy en día la figura de Don Boaventura como una figura como de los primeros líderes en contra del colonialismo portugués. Pero, sin embargo, la verdad es que la provincia portuguesa de Timor era la provincia más alejada de la metrópoli de Lisboa. Y por ejemplo, el siglo XIX, el propio gobernador portugués en Timor dijo, nuestro imperio en la isla no es nada más que solo ficción. Solo para que tengan una idea, para el año de 1970 en el censo, solo había alrededor de 500 portugueses viviendo en el territorio. En realidad, contra 450,000, alrededor de 450,000, medio millón de timorenses. En realidad, nunca hubo una ocupación formal del territorio. La isla de Timor en realidad era un territorio que se consideró, se convirtió en una prisión, era una prisión para prisioneros políticos durante el régimen de Salazar en Portugal, durante el régimen fascista en Portugal, en el cual enviaban a los prisioneros de pensamiento, a los llamados de izquierda, comunistas, anarquistas y socialistas, los enviaban a Timor como siendo uno de los lugares más alejados del territorio. Aquí les estoy presentando la imagen, por ejemplo, es una publicación portuguesa de los años 30 que presenta Timor, antecámara del infierno. En el cual consideraban Timor por el clima, por las enfermedades, por la lejanía, etc. Como les dije, para el año 1950 había 560 portugueses. En realidad nunca hubo una colonización formal del territorio, eran pequeños enclaves en la costa, pero realmente muy poco. Fue posteriormente que, como lo mencionó Cris, que la revolución de los claveles en Portugal, cuando cae el fascismo y el régimen en Portugal, que se da todo el movimiento, no solo en Timor, en todas las antiguas colonias que llevan a la independencia. De hecho, ya había una gran guerra anticolonial que se luchaba desde mucho tiempo antes en lugares como en Mozambique, donde estoy yo actualmente, en Angola, en Guinea-Bissau concretamente, donde se luchó. En Timor realmente no hubo una guerra anticolonial tan fuerte. Fue solo en el 1974-75 cuando realmente comienza a crearse los primeros movimientos políticos portugueses. Todos estos elementos que les estoy mencionando, el idioma, la religión, intentar crear una historia nacional a base, porque insisto, es una historia nacional que se está creando a través del colonialismo, de la presencia portuguesa, que es lo que lo hace diferente de Timor Occidental. Timor Occidental es totalmente austronésico y que no tiene la presencia católica, tiene una presencia más bien protestante y realmente es muy diferente. Es a través del colonialismo portugués, el idioma, etcétera, etcétera, que hace que se vayan dando algunos elementos que hacen que Timor-Leste vaya creando una identidad nacional. Sin embargo, tenemos un papel muy importante que es el artículo que yo un poco quise presentar también en la publicación que hicimos junto con Cris en los estudios de Asia y África sobre el papel de las autoridades comunitarias. Las autoridades comunitarias jugaron un papel esencial para la resistencia durante el periodo indonesio y también para la formación de la identidad nacional. Los consejos de Suco, los liurais, los reyes locales, los lianais, figuras tradicionales, se mantuvieron hasta hoy en día y son ellos los depositarios de la tradición timorense y son ellos quienes jugaron un papel muy importante que continúan a formar un papel muy importante en la formación de la identidad nacional del país. Voy a parar por aquí porque veo por motivos de tiempo, creo que estamos un poco encima ya. Si alguien se interesa, mi tesis de licenciatura, de maestría está en la biblioteca de Colegio de México, que habla mucho en detalle la formación de la formación de la identidad nacional. Habla un poco sobre la formación, el concepto de pueblo maubere, el pueblo maubere que se ha llamado al pueblo maubere el pueblo timorense, pero es un concepto que se ha creado de manera un poco artificial. Y finalmente terminaría con un breve poema de Xanana Guzmán, que dice, y alma maubere acordó, está en portugués, a alma maubere acordou, correu planícies, voou montanhas, bebeu nascentes, respirou o ar, e a linguagem ficou espírito, e o pensamento e a sua consciência. Aquí nos habla sobre el origen del pueblo maubere, cómo el pueblo maubere se levantó, corrió planicies, voló montañas, bebió de la naciente de agua, respiró del aire y de su lenguaje quedó el espíritu y el pensamiento y su conciencia. Un poema de Shanana Guzmán de abril de 1999 cuando estaba en la cárcel. Muchas gracias, colegas.
Andrés, muchas gracias. Repito que es realmente un honor y un placer que estés aquí con nosotros. Me parece que esta dupla entre Chris Laundrie y tú han sido fenomenal, y realmente da cuenta de la enorme riqueza de experiencia y de expertise que tenemos con ustedes dos. Realmente es un privilegio poder contar con ese tipo de experiencia aquí en nuestro pequeño rincón del SEA, ¿no? Dedicado al sureste asiático. Y bueno, pues podríamos decir muchas cosas. Tal vez digo lo único que a mí me encantaría hacer preguntas y comentarios, pero quiero abrir la mesa al resto del público. Solo recordar que mucho de lo que hemos estado relatando pues toca también hoy día el territorio de Papúa Occidental. Y bueno, en mi caso particular también no puedo dejar de pensar en el Tíbet, ¿no? Y en la región autónoma tibetana. Bueno, por favor, si tienen preguntas, comentarios. Nada de nada, ¿no se animan? ¿Ya le han preguntado?
I'll add something if I can without a question.
Sure.
And you know, in my talk, I use the shorthand Indonesians when I mean the Indonesian government and the Indonesian military. And, you know, I also don't want to offend my friend Effie, who's in front of me. So I hope people understood the difference. And what's fantastic to me, or what's interesting to me, is there are Indonesians who, during the Indonesian occupation, joined the guerrilla resistance in the mountains, joined Falentil. And after the referendum, there were Indonesians who decided to stay in Timor-Leste and who have become citizens of Timor-Leste. And so when I say Indonesians, I'm definitely meaning the military and the government, and that Timorese differentiate that. They differentiate the people who are responsible for their tragedy of 75 to 79 and the people who are now their neighbors, right? There really hasn't been any sort of act of international reckoning for the occupation, and most of that is political, because Indonesia is Timor-Leste's largest trading partner. And although there is still some hope for that at some point amongst civil society, but Timorese have, for the most part, moved beyond that and you know, view Indonesians as neighbors. Last week, we did a presentation on ASEAN, for example, and we were talking about how Timor-Leste might be incorporated into ASEAN. And it was Singapore who has been against it, and Indonesia has been in favor of it. So you know, the two countries are sort of moving forward together. So I did want to reinforce that I was talking about the military.
Sí, Marco. A ver, déjame acercarte el micrófono. Ahí está.
Thank you for the presentation. So what has happened to the people that had been forcibly taken into Indonesia during the occupation and afterwards?
So most of them have returned, almost all of them. In fact, anybody who wanted to return could have. So in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, over 200,000 people were forced into other places in Indonesia. And many of these people were militia members, but many of them weren't. Many of them were people who were simply thrown onto trucks and taken across the border, or thrown onto ships, brought to as far away as Java. As far as I know, so for several months, it was a very tense situation. There was a refugee camp just across the border in West Timor, where many Timorese were saying that they wanted to return, but the militias were essentially holding them hostage. And so in the East Timor Action Network had a bumper sticker that said Indonesia out of East Timor up until the 1990s. And we thought about making a bumper sticker that said East Timorese out of Indonesia, right? Because they wanted to bring the East Timorese back. There are a few East Timorese who have decided to remain Indonesian. Eurico Guterres, who was a notorious militia leader, was one. He was given the Red and White Prize by Indonesia, sort of in recognition for his success at fomenting violence. But most of them have returned. And as Andres mentioned as well in his presentation, that the political border between East and West Timor is a construction of the colonial era. And so in places like the deep southern regions of Uikusi, I've been there and people go back and forth across the border. I mean, there's border posts and stuff, but it's kind of a malleable border. And so, you know, the distinctions between states sort of blur in that region.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I want to add also a little bit, if you allow me.
Sí, sí.
No, I totally agree with what Chris was mentioning. It's quite interesting what is happening recently, also during the elections. Where what happened is recently the President Ramos Horta traveled to Kupang, to West Timor, where they were trying to, he met with the former leaders of the militia in a kind of a reconciliation. It's one of the most interesting and more symbolic movement that has been taken in the recent time. Is the President of the Republic of Timor-Leste and the Nobel Peace Prize, Ramos Horta, traveling to West Timor in Kupang. In fact, in his way, he was coming back from Jakarta after visiting the president. He went to Kupang, and in Kupang he met with Eurico Gutierrez, who is being also considered one of the more criminal leaders of the militia leaders during that. Also, in that moment, also José Ramos Horta make it clear also that they would never be a trial, an international trial like United Nations. The United Nations was always trying to promote an international trial for the crimes against humanity in Timor-Leste that the Timorese government never allowed. And José Ramos Horta make it clear that in order to make reconciliation, they will allow them to come back whenever they want, and they will never be a trial against them. So this is some of the movements that are moving recently. The other point is still around 200,000 people living in Indonesia who keep who are in Indonesia who are from Timorese citizen origin. So that is something that is also created some tension in terms of, as I'm going back to the elections, because Timor-Leste has been trying to incorporate them into the voting, polling out of country, and Indonesia is not allowing that. Indonesia so far is not allowing to have a double nationality, and one of the negotiations that is trying to do the government of Timor-Leste currently is to allow double citizenship to the Timorese who are still living in Indonesian territory. That's all from my side.
I would add as well, there's a literature on this reconciliation process. I've written 2 articles on it, but tons of other people as well. And that is after 1999, militia members were coming back, and there's a process called nahibiti, or rolling up the mat, also called lisan, which is sort of an indigenous justice system for bringing people back and reincorporating them into their community. It's one of the reasons I went to Uikusi. And it's been very successful. There's been in Timor-Leste, there's been no large scale acts of what's the word, against former militia members, you know, for the sake of revenge. It just doesn't exist. So the Timorese have been very good about reconciliation on their own part, especially given the traumatic history.
¿Alguien más? ¿Nadie se anima? Pues yo me voy a animar, aprovechando que están aquí los dos. Andrés, quisiera preguntarte sobre todo, hay muchas cosas que se me agolpan, ¿no? Pero reduciéndome a dos temas así muy breves. Primero, como cónsul mexicano en Dili, ¿puedes decirnos algo? ¿Existe alguna posición diplomática mexicana formal con relación a Timor-Leste? ¿Han tenido algún tipo de actividad, más allá de la actividad enorme que has realizado tú a partir de tu posición y tu carrera? México, en términos diplomáticos, ¿qué tipo de relación guarda con Timor-Leste? ¿Y ha cambiado algo en los últimos 20 años esa posición?
Muchas gracias. Bueno, primeramente solo aclarar, yo no soy el cónsul honorario es mi pareja. Yo como funcionario de la ONU no puedo ser cónsul, pero bueno, nosotros tenemos el consulado, es en casa. Mi pareja es el que es el cónsul honorario de México, el señor Ivanildo Quirino do Nascimento, de nacionalidad brasileña. Te puedo decir, México nunca reconoció a la invasión indonesia del territorio y siempre apoyó en Naciones Unidas, siempre apoyó las resoluciones en favor de la independencia de Timor desde el primer momento. Entonces, México siempre tuvo una posición muy activa de reconocimiento de la independencia de Timor-Leste, siempre la tuvo. México, después de Brasil, fue el primer país en establecer relaciones diplomáticas, el primer país de América Latina, perdón, en establecer relaciones diplomáticas con Timor-Leste, aún estableciendo, aún durante la administración de Naciones Unidas. Como lo mencionó Chris, la administración de Naciones Unidas tuvo lugar entre 1999 y el año 2002. Durante ese periodo, México ya estableció relaciones con la administración de Naciones Unidas para Timor-Leste. Y inmediatamente después de la independencia del 20 de mayo del 2002, México fue el segundo país después de Brasil en reconocer la independencia. El segundo país de América Latina. Es muy interesante, y aquí quiero hablar un poco desde el punto de vista anecdótico, que la relación de México con Timor no es reciente y no solo es eso. Hay algunos anécdotas históricos en la relación de Timor, y hasta hoy en día, por ejemplo, se utilizan las monedas de plata mexicanas. Las monedas de plata mexicanas que llegaron a Timor a través del galeón de Manila, a través de Manila, y después en el siglo XIX a través del gobierno de Porfirio Díaz enviando los pesos mexicanos de plata. Los pesos de plata mexicanos circularon en Timor, fueron monedas de uso corriente hasta 1950. Y aún se mantienen muchas monedas de plata en Timor-Leste, y la dote cuando alguien se va a casar hoy en día en Timor, aún se da en monedas mexicanas, como llaman ellos, las mexicanas. ¿Cuántas mexicanas das por tu esposa, por no sé qué, durante la dote se da en mexicanas? Y tan interesante es que, por ejemplo, aún se pueden comprar estas monedas, se encuentran estas monedas en diferentes partes. Y yo tuve aquí la curiosidad, siempre que voy al interior del país, buscar estas monedas de plata mexicanas, y me encontré con monedas de plata mexicanas, que era una moneda de plata, etcétera, el escudo nacional, República Mexicana, 1805. Obviamente en 1805 no había República Mexicana. O sea, se han llegado a falsificar, a hacer fake pesos de plata mexicanos, fakes, que se han ido haciendo a lo largo de la historia en Timor, que son, y se encuentran. Entonces dice República Mexicana 1805, no, es fake, no existe, no puede ser, eso no es, históricamente no lo es. Entonces es interesante ver cómo Timor tiene una relación de largo tiempo con México, tiene una relación también por parte de la Iglesia Católica. Ahí tenemos nosotros con el consulado de México allá, tenemos la participación, por ejemplo, tenemos monjas, sacerdotes que van allá, misioneros. Tenemos otro caso, otra anécdota curiosa, ¿no? Había una monja mexicana, maya, de Yucatán, que fue a vivir a Los Palos, donde aprendió el idioma fatoluco. Yo le decía a ella, yo estoy seguro que tú eres la única persona en la historia de la humanidad que habla fatuluco y maya. No creo que haya nadie en la historia de la humanidad que pueda comunicarse en maya, porque ella era una maya de Yucatán y hablaba fatuluco en Timor-Leste. Entonces, hay una serie de paralelismos e historias que nos han acercado a lo largo del tiempo. Ahora, el consulado honorario depende de la Embajada de México en Indonesia, en Yakarta, y atiende a una pequeña comunidad mexicana. Hoy por hoy somos en realidad 5, 6, 7, hemos llegado a ser 20 mexicanos viviendo en Timor-Leste. Tenemos, por ejemplo, uno de los negocios de buceo más importante del país, lo tiene un chico de Cancún. Iván es un chico mexicano de Cancún y él tiene un negocio de buceo allá. Tenemos aparte de los religiosos, etcétera, etcétera. Además, los mexicanos que van con los organismos de Naciones Unidas o con las ONGs, etcétera, etcétera. Es muy interesante ver que hay Corona, tequila, etcétera, etcétera. Pero bueno, no hay una relación comercial fuerte. Podremos comprender que Timor es muy pequeño, pero hay algún tipo de relación.
Mil gracias, Andrés. Bueno, pues ya estamos sobre el tiempo, pero no puedo dejar de aprovechar una última pregunta, que es un poco egoísta en este caso, porque es más nacida de la curiosidad de las cosas que de manera muy breve me tocó observar cuando estuve ahí hace 3, 4 años. Yo en particular estoy trabajando líneas de antropología ambiental y cambio climático, y me tocó trabajar con un equipo internacional muy interesante en relación con los esfuerzos de conservación en el bosque, en el Parque Nacional. Ay,
Conis.
Conis. Y una de las cosas que observé, bueno, a mí me tocó ver que parecía estar habiendo una transición a formas de conservación que no necesariamente se veían de manera muy favorable por actores más o menos establecidos, notablemente australianos y otros actores que podríamos decir del mundo occidental, y que la gente más y más estaba dependiendo de redes locales de conocimiento tradicional y ambiental y redes sociales locales para gestionar sus recursos naturales. Claro, hay todo tipo de tensiones ahí, intracomunitarias, regionales, nacionales, pero lo que vi fue que había parecía haber un poco de tensión con relación sobre todo a ONGs y a organismos australianos. Yo creo que precisamente a raíz era muy fresco todo este tema, porque hubo un escándalo, ¿no?, de espionaje a nivel de diplomático en relación con estas negociaciones sobre la explotación del petróleo en el estrecho de Timor. Y una cosa que vi con un poco de inquietud es que se estaban empezando a meter en esa especie de vacío que estaba quedando en términos de ayudas internacionales, intereses rusos y chinos. Pero no sé qué tan sobredimensionado habrá sido para mí ver eso, sobre todo en lugares más remotos, ¿no? En la provincia de Los Palos. Y qué rol pudieran estar jugando otras naciones, otras potencias en relación con la explotación de recursos naturales. Si tú has visto algo de eso.
Bueno, mencionaste una cosa, definitivamente rusos no, rusos no, sin embargo chinos sí. De hecho, la embajada de China en Dili es una embajada muy grande y ha habido una negociación para permitir la creciente emigración de chinos a al país, y que vas hoy al lugar más remoto del país y encuentras las famosas tienditas de los chinos donde venden todas las cuestiones de plástico, donde vienen todo esto que viene Sí hay una presión muy grande de China, una presión, de hecho, durante unas semanas atrás, cuando se estaba ya a punto de cerrar la negociación de la entrada de Timor a ASEAN, el propio Ramos Horta dijo, bueno, si no nos admiten en ASEAN, nos vamos a tener que acercar más a China. Lo dijo como una manera de poner presión. El presidente Ramos Horta lo dijo como una manera de poner presión para que los aceptaran en ASEAN. Respecto a la conservación, hay algunas cosas que yo te podría decir sin ser mi área, por lo que yo he visto. Hay una serie de ONGs portuguesas que están intentando colaborar, especialmente con apoyo de la cooperación portuguesa para la restauración. Como dijo Chris, el principal producto que llevó a los portugueses a Timor fue la madera del sándalo, que casi está extinta. Entonces se está intentando una reintroducción de la madera del sándalo, de los bosques de sándalo en el territorio de Timor a través de ONG portuguesas con apoyo del Instituto Camões y de la Unión Europea. Lamentablemente el país es muy pequeño, tenemos serios problemas, por ejemplo, a pesar de ser un país productor de gas y de petróleo, pero hay serio problema de combustible y la gente al interior sigue usando leña como principal fuente de combustible para cocinar y para sus funciones. Entonces, es una pena porque vemos en las carreteras de Timor las toneladas y toneladas de madera que se corta y los árboles que se cortan como leña para combustible. Y eso es una pena, que siendo un país productor de gas y de petróleo no se hayan parado. Los parques nacionales cada vez están más limitados y la población crece y está bajo una fuerte presión de la juventud que necesita sobrevivir de algún modo, y entonces realmente vemos hoy por hoy las fotografías aéreas del territorio donde está casi talado, ya casi no existen áreas de conservación y es una gran pena. No sé, Chris, si tú tienes algo más al respecto.
No, not really, because I'm not super familiar with Timorese policy on the environment. The NGO Lauhamutuk does a lot of work on this, however, and they've released reports. For example, the Timorese government had an opportunity to convert power to solar, I believe, to provide solar power for a lot of the country. But what they chose to do instead was to fix these old diesel-powered generators, and at about the same cost. And so I think that some of the decisions that the Timorese leadership are making are definitely short-term and not in the long term, including things that have to do with environmental policy. So the conference I went to in Seattle a couple of weeks ago was on tourism, or the panel was on tourism, and somebody had talked about Timor as a place for green tourism. And so that certainly exists, and may, as closely tied to business and capitalism as it is, it may provide an impetus for preservation of some green spaces in Timor. But I really can't say much more than that.
Mil gracias, Andrés. Sí, ya me acordé, es Nino Connie Santana, ¿no? El nombre completo del parque. Bueno, a ver, como digo, ya podríamos quedarnos aquí en larga conversación, pero se me hace que ha de ser más allá ya de la medianoche, ¿no? ¿Estás en Maputo? ¿En dónde estás tú, Andrés?
Estoy en Maputo, van a dar las 10 de la noche.
Ya, bien, ok. Estamos un poco preocupados por tu salud. Bueno, pues vamos a cerrar aquí la mesa. Nuevamente agradecemos profundamente tu participación, Andrés, y el esfuerzo que has hecho para poder estar aquí y ofrecernos algo de tu experiencia y sabiduría en esto. Chris, mil gracias por esta magnífica recorrido, ¿no? Por tu exposición y tu experiencia también de este proceso.
Gracias.
Pues aquí finalizamos. Muchas gracias a todos y esperamos pronto o la otra vez tener este tipo de conversación. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Cris. Muchas gracias, Carlos. Muchas gracias.
Ah.
Acá.